Hello, and welcome to today's event on Islam and women's rights in Afghanistan and the launching of the Islam and Negotiation Action Guide for Muslim Women. I'm Elaine Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And we are so pleased to be hosting this event today in partnership with the United States Institute for Peace. Before we begin, a word on interpretation. For those of you who would like English to Dari interpretation, in other words, to listen to this program in Dari, click the translation button in your meeting controls on your computer. You will see a round globe symbol at the bottom of the page noting language interpretation. If you are on a mobile device, it's going to be where those three dots are in the corner, and you can see language interpretation found there. So this is for those who want to listen to this discussion in Dari. So again, if you'd like to hear it in Dari, click Dari. Many of you have already submitted questions in advance of this program, and we are going to get to questions at the end of the discussion with our esteemed panelists. But if you have a question that pops into your head as you're listening to this discussion, you can still provide them by using the Q&A function again on your controls. And now to begin. We come together as Afghanistan has just marked 1 year since the Taliban took control of the country. It's been a very, very trying year for Afghans. The Afghan people are suffering from a devastating humanitarian crisis, and its economy and banking system are near collapse. And the Taliban has imposed draconian restrictions on women and girls. Their situation is so grave that it's been described as, by one source, as tantamount to a death sentence in slow motion. The rights have been decimated, including the rights to an education, the right to work, the right to enjoy freedom of movement. Women have been forced to stay home and leave public life. Even how they dress has been regulated. The Ministry of Vice and Virtue has decreed that women be covered from head to toe, forced to cover even their faces. And if they leave their homes, they must be accompanied by male chaperones. Violence against women has increased, and protesters have been dealt with very harshly. Now, the Taliban justify these terrible violations of human rights on the basis of their radical interpretation of Islam. They have essentially hijacked Islam for their political ends. Today, we are launching the Islam and Negotiation Action Guide for Muslim women. It's a practical tool designed to assist specifically women negotiators to be able to understand and articulate the connections between Islamic values and women's rights, a guide to help Muslim women to understand and defend their rights. The action guide is published by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and we're grateful for the support from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Women Forward International, USIP, and Women Global Leaders. We will now hear from Afghan women experts and leading scholars on Islam, who will discuss how Muslim women negotiators and international policymakers can use this new critical tool to demonstrate that women's rights are not inconsistent with Islam. And to start our conversation, we will hear from my colleague, Dr. Aisha Kadishi Oralana, who is an expert on peace building in the Muslim world, as well as on the role of gender in Islam. At the Georgetown Institute, she leads signature research on Islamic arguments in support of gender equality, and she is the lead author of the toolkit. So Aisha, we are so happy to have you with us today to discuss this new tool. Can you help us by describing the purpose of the action guide, how it can be used to support women's rights in Afghanistan, and how does it refute the Taliban's assertion that Islam and women's rights are inconsistent?
Thank you so much, Milan, for this opportunity. As you said, the purpose of this toolkit is to support Muslim negotiators, especially Muslim women negotiators, in settings from official negotiations to unofficial negotiations. And unlike other toolkits, this toolkit provides the necessary Islamic legal and theological arguments to resolve conflicts peacefully through negotiations and advance gender justice. So it is designed as a practical tool for Muslim women negotiators to ensure that their rights are understood, effectively debated, and secured in settings where Islam informs the perspective of the parties. We know that each negotiation context is unique and is informed and shaped by historical, political, and religious and cultural context it takes place. In many contexts, like in Afghanistan, religion is a powerful constituent of cultural norms and values. Religious values and beliefs significantly impact the negotiation process as a result. So to effectively negotiate, the negotiators must understand this context and adjust to the changing circumstances constantly. For example, in Afghanistan, the use of religious language and reliance on Islamic arguments provide a certain level of legitimacy and power to those who use it, therefore a part of the political negotiation strategy. However, Taliban and other religious extremists, as you said, hijack their religion and use their own interpretations of Islam for political purposes, including justifying exclusion of women from social, political, and economic life. And if we do not know the counter arguments, what Islam really says, we cannot argue back. Because Taliban frames their policies and actions in a religious framework, it is imperative for negotiators to learn this language and have a very strong grounding in the Islamic tradition, its sources, to respond to their claims effectively. Most literature on negotiation focuses on secular negotiation models derived from the experiences of the scholars and experts in North America and European contexts. While these models offer valuable guidance and insight, they are often one-size-fits approach, and it does not reflect the realities, values, and systems of meaning of all the parties involved. As many Muslim scholars have shown, Islamic tradition offers a very strong framework for building democratic, equitable social, economic, political institutions that respect and value human rights, including women's rights. So for this reason, this toolkit we collected Quranic, prophetic, and historical evidence to refute Taliban's claim and to show that what they're doing is against God's demand and definitely un-Islamic. So the first section of the toolkit provides an Islamic framework with examples from the holy text and prophetic tradition, and also includes various strategies and tools for women negotiators, particularly to overcome some of the specific challenges they face during negotiations. We also show, for example, how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used negotiation and diplomacy to resolve conflicts and build peace. We also show that women engage in negotiations since the very early days of Islam. For example, the Prophet's wife, Khadija, was a businesswoman and who was known to be a great negotiator. We also know that during the negotiation process of Hudaybiyah peace treaty, the Prophet had a very diverse team of negotiators, which included at least 2 female negotiators. The second section of the guide provides Islamic legal and theological arguments regarding gender justice. It also offers negotiation exercises and case studies that support women's rights. For example, this section shows that Quran specifically mentions women, like men, have rights, such as rights to education, working in diverse fields, choose their own husband, have a right to divorce, among many others. So we show how through these examples, from the Quranic examples as well as the prophetic tradition, how wrong Taliban's claims are, and we strongly refute their arguments. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Aisha. That was a wonderful overview of what's in the toolkit and how it can be useful, and what it's been, how it's been laid out to make it accessible to those who need it as an important guide. We're going to turn now to Dr. Homa Hoodfar. She is a scholar and civil society leader, widely respected for her work on women's roles in public life in Muslim societies. She's an active member of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, a network that promotes human rights and gender justice for women whose lives are governed by extreme interpretations of Islam. She's also a professor emerita at Concordia University, where she researches Afghan refugees in Iran and Pakistan, as well as women in formal and informal politics. Welcome, Dr. Homa. It's wonderful to have you with us today. I want to ask you, from your experience, which ranges across many, many different contexts, can you tell us what you've seen for women negotiating their rights in Islamic societies? And what have you learned, particularly that could be applicable to Afghanistan?
Well, thank you very much for organizing this session, but also for giving me this opportunity to share my experiences or other women living under Muslim law experiences with you. From the beginning, we faced, like, when religion was politicized and especially weaponized against women's rights. So our goal was to reach out to the public and to the leaders to discuss this. And this was in 1984, when there wasn't much other activity around this issue. So so I just briefly go through the lesson learned, and I'm happy to then open up issues that you are interested. One of the major issue was that this negotiation to bring public in and should not be viewed as a short-term or one way 3 years or 5 years, but rather generational policy. So it's something that we have to continue because Islam is part of everyday life there. And so the other thing is to start the dialogue with the conservative leaders, and that should be really started from the beginning with respect for both sides, and trying to learn each other's point of view, because that's one of the major complaints that conservatives have in their dialogue with secular forces. The other thing, dialogue should start from what we have in common, whether secular or religious, conservative religious forces, and that is the essence of all Muslims believe the essence of Islam is justice. And in fact, justice is also used for peace building, because if there is no peace, you can't have justice. The other thing we have in common is that that God has created men and women from the same soul, and in their eyes is equal, except through their deeds. Not the difference does not come from the biology. So these are the very two important starting point that we have in common, whether it's conservative and also it starts a negotiation in a different platform, not to adversaries, but also people who try to understand each other. One of the central issues is also having women-centered interpretation of the text, which of course in the 80s were very limited, but now we have a lot more thanks to scholars, but unfortunately these are not sipped into the public general, which is the work of civil society should do that. The other factor is then to really have start making alliances with other leaders, especially progressive religious male leaders. And so those are also very important factors, as we saw. Also, starting from what the majority of women are interested in, say, access to education, economic situation, family law. Those are things brings all the women involved, and always, because even the conservative leaders, whether they're part of the state or non-state actors or just the local leaders, their strength comes from the public, and they have to be able to mobilize the public, and women will be mobilized around those issues. So it's also, that was very important to also build their knowledge through that from the Islamic perspective, to have the discussion from to also have to have this discussion that in fact women's rights are not a zero sum. Therefore, if women's more rights of women are acknowledged, that doesn't mean men are losing, but that means that society and families can live in much more harmony and security. So that's one of the issues we always raise, because it's very important that to men to be involved. Another factor that is important is that Muslim societies tend to be the young nations. And I understand that Afghanistan especially is the youngest nation in terms of age of its population. So therefore, it's very important that we reach out to people from the very young age, from a school age, and not just reach out to the girls, but especially reach out to the boys, and so that we start recognizing, discussing rights from the earliest stage. And that's why it's a long-term project, and we shouldn't give up, think about short term. And this debates with example is also very important, because culture and religion is seen often as one. Like a lot of cultural tradition, especially harmful tradition, is justified in the name of Islam, and therefore it's hard to resist. But if we show these differences, and also show how different society live their Islam, especially women, how they live their Islam and their differences. Familiarity with different way that Muslims live their Islam makes it easier for women to accept changes, and opens them up for a lot more discussion on things previously thought it was, as they said often, is written on a stone, because they realize it's not Islamic order. And so those were the main issues that we learned. In fact, working with conservative, we often felt we empowered them by giving them this knowledge, but because a lot of conservative leaders, especially women leaders, also do not have the knowledge, so they become much more powerful to negotiate with the leaders. And this is especially was important when they have to negotiate with the state, like the situation in Iran and probably today in Afghanistan. So we can also empower conservative women leaders for women's rights, without them giving up their religion. I think my time is up, so I stop here, and then I'm happy to continue this discussion later on. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Hoodfar, thank you for that. It was a rich exposition of some of the key points that you've learned through the negotiating process. And I think some of those touchstones of dialogue in terms of respect and commitment to justice and equality, alliances with other religious leaders, and the really important to underscore, this isn't a zero-sum game, that when rights for women are committed to and underscored and practiced, it does not diminish the rights of men. In fact, it enriches all of society, and so many other points you raised. So we will come back to some of those, I'm sure, because I would imagine there'll be questions from our audience in following up. But before we go to the audience, we're going to go now to Palwasha Hassan, who is a senior fellow at the Georgetown Institute. She is the former director of the Afghan Women's Educational Center, a major NGO in support of Afghan women and their education, a very critical issue today and has always been. She's also a founder of the Afghan Women's Network and is a tireless advocate, as we've all discovered working with her over the last year, just a tireless advocate for women's participation in politics and peace building with extensive experience in civil society groups. Palwasha, you have been watching what is evolving in Afghanistan, and it's been a very difficult set of experiences in this last year as the Taliban continue to repress women's rights. What are you hearing from your contacts on the ground about what, if anything, can change Taliban behavior, particularly on women's rights? And how do you see this toolkit as someone who has worked for so long in Afghanistan with civil society? How do you see this toolkit being useful?
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Professor Hotfar and Aisha, for setting the precedence. I think this is a very important topic and something that some of us has worked for years. As Homa was saying, it's not like a short sum of an activity. It is a long time project that one have to make sure that it's like a generational issue, and each time there is a new challenge. And I think with Taliban being only introduced with a very conservative and maybe extremist definition of Islam, they have also need to learn more from what a woman has went through that journey of working with others, and also learning from the experiences of other countries with progressive interpretation of Islam. And another important point that Homajan mentioned regarding, like, it is not about taking over the space from each other. It is like about the coexistence. And in Afghanistan, unfortunately, the situation is very grim and drastic decline in human rights, but also the humanitarian situation cannot be understated the way it's affecting. For 22 million people in the risk of famine, it is just not a number. It is people and women of the country who will suffer most in this situation. So it's overall situation that is affecting the situation of women, beside what are some of the policies of Taliban who are putting them in a very limited situation. But I think the important thing is that over the years of conflict, women also learn how to maneuver these spaces, how to navigate around these difficult circumstances and find their possibility for themselves. I think the latest example has been the earthquake situation in southeast of the country, where women groups with very small possibility, they went there and they tried to engage in that humanitarian work along men and international community who were trying to help those affected by the earthquake. And in this spaces, some of the video which become viral on the social media showed that women use this opportunity for raising and negotiating for their situation. They were talking about girls' right to education, and they engage in dialogue with the authority. So that is a good example that women of Afghanistan knows how to work around these difficult circumstances. While it is important to keep the international lobby on, but probably it didn't respond so far, and the Taliban has not responded positively despite of their promises from time to time. The schools are still closed. Afghanistan is the only country with no secondary school for girls in the Islamic world. there are many things which could continue besides the international pressure and lobby internationally. It's also important that we keep support of these ground level, small breakthrough that women have created themselves, the remerging of the women groups, the way that Islamic arguments are used by women. And I'm seeing the role of this toolkit and maybe similar work to be continued so that women are more equipped and they could enter those spaces which are actually the power dynamics lies there. And Islam or religion has always been used and abused by men in the country to limit women. And it's time for women to claim those spaces for themselves and counter back for their own protection, not to fight for the reason of taking over the power, but to protect their own spaces and continue to live in the country as equal citizen. So
Thanks, Pawasha. I think your emphasis on those small ground level breakthroughs and how important they are and how empowered Afghan women have been in their own way and will continue in this struggle, entering those spaces, as you call them, with the power dynamics that exist in them and negotiating as they can. So thank you for that perspective. I think it's a really important one. And we're going to turn now to another perspective with Ambassador Roya Rahmani and bringing her into this conversation. She is a lifelong advocate as well for Afghan women and girls, as well as being a trailblazing diplomat and scholar. She was the first woman ambassador to the United States for Afghanistan. Earlier, she served as Afghanistan's ambassador to Indonesia. And prior to her diplomatic career, she focused on women's rights and education, working with several organizations in Afghanistan. And currently, happily, we're happy to say, serves as a distinguished fellow at Georgetown's Institute. Roya, let's talk about how diplomacy works in this space, and you have considerable experience in that area. What are your thoughts, given this topic, from a diplomatic perspective? How can policymakers, for example, utilize the arguments in the toolkit to affect Taliban behavior, if at all? And there is so much discussion today, and we understand the importance of bringing the region into solutions for a better future for Afghanistan. But how can the predominantly Muslim states in the region, who for the most part do not share the Taliban's interpretation of Islam on women's rights, how can they be engaged to make a difference on this topic? So help us see this application into the diplomatic realm.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Vivier. It is a true pleasure to be speaking among all the other distinguished speakers and on this very important occasion. Let me summarize my input in 3 different points. First, starting with the US and what United States and the regional countries together could do, given that US has been leading the outlook or the view or the general diplomatic view towards Afghanistan over the past several decades. United States can use its leverage over the rest of the Muslim countries and the regional countries specifically to incentivize them to look at Afghanistan not only as an immediate security issue, but long-term security, development, and social relevance. Just like countries normally would do, looking at their neighboring countries. Generally speaking, the region, including the Muslim neighbors of Afghanistan and beyond, they have never had have been concerned about the human rights issues in Afghanistan. If anything, even some countries were worried when they saw Afghanistan was making good progress in terms of respecting and protecting human rights. Similarly, they never looked at development and social issues as relevant to their own development. I am, of course, talking about the development, economic and social development in Afghanistan. So to change this calculus, United States needs to utilize tactful diplomacy that would have direct implication for Muslim countries that have ties both to United States and relevance to Afghanistan. This is now more possible and timely than it was decades ago or even 10 years ago. And that has become possible because of the technological advancements, whether it is the demonstrated over the horizon military capabilities or e-commerce or the possibility of promoting ideology through social media. My second point is about how the Taliban could be potentially influenced. And to do that, what I have to say is to influence Taliban's action towards women, it's important to pay attention, close attention to the why they do what they do. In Afghanistan, historically, women involuntarily have been charged with the responsibility of showcasing how Islamic the regime under which they live is. Hence, the more Islamic the government claimed to be, the more rights women have had to lose. Let me be clear here. I'm not saying that our problem is the religion, but rather how and who interprets it, but most importantly, for what purpose. So Taliban use oppression of women as a bonding glue to help them stick together around the very version of the Islam that they have created for themselves. So to influence, negotiations should be directly linked to hard issues such as security, intelligence, economic relations, banking, etc., to that of women's rights. Make no mistakes, the group, I mean the Taliban, is making every aspect of women's lives matter, of women's lives a matter that has specific orders from heaven. So they cannot be settled down with statements of condemnations and demands to do better. My third point, last but not least, is that it's really important that the Muslim countries take a more vocal stance about Islam and women's rights. Issue declarations, gave media statements. After all, Taliban's main claim is that they are the purest Islamic regime. And they show that by controlling and oppressing women because they can. Since there are no over-the-horizon measures that would bar the Taliban from abusing half of the population, the best and most sustainable way to address this is to empower women with education and economic opportunities, so that first they can make it to the table and defend their rights, including from religious bases, that this toolkit will come very helpful and handy. I thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Rahmani. I think those are excellent points in terms of what can be done and all too often is not being done in terms of the leverage the United States has on this, how to always connect women's rights to the hard issues, whether they're economic, banking, whatever, and also the need for Muslim countries to really stand up for women's rights and what difference that would make. So lots here to understand and to unpack as we go forward. We're going to do one quick round with all of you before we go to the audience questions. And let me just ask each of you very, very briefly, what do you think are the most promising ways to use this action guide, and specifically perhaps one recommendation for our audience to take this tool forward and apply it in ways that are concrete and can make a difference? So Aisha, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yes, I think I completely agree with my colleagues. Like Dr. Palwasha Hassan said, it is really important for women to have a space at the negotiation. And one of the ways in which this toolkit can be used is to provide those women with the necessary training, skill sets that have been sort of rooted in the Islamic tradition. So that's an important element. So the next stage, what we're doing is that we are taking parts of this toolkit and making shorter briefs. We've already translated them into Dari so that this will be much more helpful in local languages. The next step is going to be translate the whole toolkit into Dari and then Arabic. And so that way we could reach to more women so that they don't have to know the English version. Also, I agree with my distinguished colleague and Ambassador Rahmani that Muslim world has to really step up, especially Muslim women around the world. And this can be sort of a starting point, this toolkit, to start a conversation and deepen it. There's so much more we have to do. I think that's how we start first, and translating into local languages and offering it as a training tool for women. But also, I think this toolkit will also be useful for non-Muslim negotiators to understand how Islam views gender justice, to also overcome some of the stereotypes about Islam as a religion that oppresses women. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Dr. Hodfar.
Well, I want to second what Aisha has mentioned, but also add to the fact that we can't just say put pressure on the Muslim society to come forward. I think we have to arrange for many of Afghan leaders, especially those not trained with this kit, to go and visit people in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Turkey, in Iran and others, and discuss how, in fact, Taliban are using Islam, and meet with religious leaders in those countries and ask them to issue. I mean, the reality is most governments in the Muslim majority countries cannot really issue a statement on Islam, but religious leaders could, women's organization could. And so we have to mobilize those things we can. I do remember, well, as I'm older than many of your other leaders, that when the fall of the Taliban in 2001, and between 2002 and 2004, a lot of women from civil society, from Muslim majority countries came, gave experiences, shared with them, but these links were not actually kept. Now we have links to the West, but not so much linked to the Muslim society. I think we need to create that, and we need to create it also to think of a long term, because today is Afghanistan, tomorrow maybe Iran or some other countries. We do need to have these linkages to support one another at a more global level. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's an excellent concrete advice for follow-up here. And we'll go now to Palwasha.
Thank you. I would say there are two ways, and one is like at a macro level and involving politically maybe the Islamic world, which Ambassador Rahmani spoke about, how to engage Islamic countries, and they should come forward on that level. So I will not speak on that, but it's also important that we also have a ground level, what Homajan also referred, maybe regional civil society organization, especially those with Islamic knowledge and perspective, with a progressive Islamic perspective for women's right to be engaged in Afghanistan. So we have to encourage, support, and invest in that kind of networking in Afghanistan. But on another hand, it's also important to invest the way women have defined their solution to support them for what they are already doing in communities. So to look to the humanitarian support to Afghanistan, not in a limited view, that could be used in a new nexus of peace building, negotiation, and the way women has used those spaces for their rights prevalence, and the way they have navigated that need to be noted, supported, and encouraged.
Thank you. And finally to Ambassador Roya.
Thank you. My one word is use technology. I have found it most captivating and practical way to disseminate information to engage younger population. It is has been proven to be one of the most effective ways to do that. And through technology, we can give the younger population and generation the option to choose for themselves how to understand and engage with the religion rather than prescribe them. It's a most powerful tool nowadays available. Utilize that for this as well.
Good point. And the part of the world that we're talking about has a predominantly young population. So good advice there as well. I'm going to turn now to our colleague, Ali Smith, to help us transmit the questions from the audience to you. Unless they're specifically directed to you, just let us know who'd like to take the question. Ali?
Sure. The first question we have is, does this toolkit cover all the different schools of thought in Islam? How does it account for differences within Islamic traditions? Perhaps, Aisha, you can start if others want to weigh in after.
Yes, in the toolkit, we initially talk about the different schools of thought, how they interpret the Quranic text, etc. But we relied mostly, not only, but mostly on the Hanafi tradition, because this was mostly targeted for Afghan women. And the main tradition in Afghanistan is Hanafi. But the toolkit also provides examples from the Quran and the Hadith, which are beyond the Hanafi tradition only. And we do mention other interpretations occasionally, but we had to make a choice because otherwise it would have been much, much longer. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Aisha. The next one has to do with how this toolkit applies to the education issue right now, asking how can US policymakers and others use this scholarship to support women's education in Afghanistan? What specific arguments are most effective?
Who would like to tackle that? Roya, one of the things you did mention was how the US can better use its leverage. Perhaps you can tie it to girls' education and the ongoing challenge there.
Sure. Well, thank you. One of the most practical potential ways to do this would be as number one, Taliban has barred everybody from education. So however education the girls would receive has to be through informal ways. And within these informal ways, if there is a possibility to incorporate a section that would utilize the information that this toolkits provide, would be very helpful to arm the girls, not only with the general education that would help them navigate life and help them hopefully at a later point seek further education and get jobs and whatnot, but also to be able to make those arguments. The very first aspect of this is to even enable women through a system of education to ask questions, to challenge and to ask very basic, simple questions of, okay, so if it's prescribed, why it's prescribed, and then provide them with these options. That would be one way.
Okay, Aisha, you had your hand up.
Yes, so in the toolkit, we also talk about not only the Quran, education for girls is a right, but also a divine command for the woman. So we also provide historical examples, including prophetic examples, how his daughters and his wives were very well educated. And we also provide examples from other Muslim countries where There's no other Muslim country that bans from education in the world currently, except Afghanistan right now, while there are so many other issues. But so we also have made a short brief that focuses on this issue that's been also translated into Dari, that explains all the rights of women in terms of education, giving examples from different Muslim contexts as well. And it's on the website of the JWIPS.
Well, I think this is an important question that we just heard, because we don't often tie the right to girls and women's education in the context of the rights under Islam, which the Taliban are using to object and restrict those rights. So that might be one of the most concrete ways to move forward on this. Does anybody else want to comment on this question? Okay, we'll move on otherwise.
Great. The next question I have here is, what specific recommendations do you have for donors looking to support women's rights in the framework of Islamic rights? What types of programs are most impactful, and where is support needed? And I'll put a second one in here as well. Are there any risks for women in utilizing the toolkit? If so, how can we mitigate?
Okay, how can donors be more engaged on this? And then are there any risks attached to women supporting their rights using the toolkit? Who would like to begin? Palwasha? Oh, and then we'll go to you, Dr. Hoodfar.
I think donor can use this, as I said, like, let's not take humanitarian assistance just for a one-time charity or support to women, or to the communities. It's important to see that as with a dynamic of development, peace building, and what is called like a triple nexus approach to the whole issue, which is there in Afghanistan. And it's important to encourage partnership between local organizations, especially women-led organization, into the process. I think women themselves know how to use these knowledge the way they've already demonstrated in, as I gave earlier, the example of women in Paktika going for supporting the relief for the earthquake affected area. They have started speaking about girls' education with the authority there in the province. That means like they know how to navigate, how to use that. It's important to give them this tool. It's already translated in local language. We need to translate it both in Pashto and Dari and get it as much as possible to the communities, and make sure that peace building is part of whatever intervention on humanitarian and development that we're doing. So that will be one way for the international community or donors to support those initiatives, which is helping with enhancing protection for women through supporting negotiation that they want to lead. And the risk will be minimized when women are part of design of these solution and projects. They know where they want to enter and how to use and utilize those possibilities.
Thank you, Homa.
Well, I also think what Parvasha said is very important, to have women involved because they know the context and the risk better. But also wanted to say, in this case, I think also international funders can support things like making these toolkits into a workshop or video interview around it, put the information more available in a way, as Roya said, through technology, and it can reach out well. Part of the problem, at least in decades experience that we have had with funders, sometimes funders fund things and then they want to put it on their website and promote their site, and that creates a danger and risk for the people in another way. So I think we need to be a little bit more careful about just promoting funders, but to have this condition that were, I mean, depending to what society, I mean, today may not be such a big risk, but the same thing maybe 5 years down the line be risk to women who use it. But using technology and making this into videos, examples in different languages, not just Dari, but Arabic and Farsi and Turkish, it's because it's a useful kit for everyone in Muslim majority society to use. Thank you.
Yes, I would agree with that. And Aisha, you might want to follow up what Homa just said,
Absolutely.
both in terms of our own experience when donors were approached. There was considerable interest because of the recognition that this is seldom raised as an important investment and one that can make a difference, but also building on what was just said.
Absolutely, yes.
Did you
Great.
want to add anything to what Homa just said?
No, I think we covered a lot of the important points. Translation of this toolkit into different languages, that's one area to support. I think workshops is really, really important. Organizing smaller conversations to support and bring together Islamic leaders, men and women. I think there was a question in the chat, is this toolkit only for women? It is for all Muslims and non-Muslims who wants to understand what are some of the basic principles of peacemaking, negotiation, and gender justices within the Islamic tradition. So you supporting those meetings is very important. Adding to that is, understanding unique challenges in each context is very important. Exemplar women leaders from Muslim world. We have so many amazing women scholars, leaders, that they could also be brought together to strategize how to most effectively respond to threats like this to women's rights in general. Thank you.
No, that's good. Allie?
Yes, I think I was going to build off the one Aisha just touched on, which is the question in the chat about, are there any initiatives targeting men role models? Is the guide targeted only for women? So if others have thoughts on that, go ahead. And then we have a second question here, perhaps this is for Homa, on how can this toolkit be used as a resource for non-Muslim groups and other minority groups living in Muslim countries under Muslim law?
Okay, who would like to begin with that? Homa, do you want to take the last question
Yes.
first and then we can go forward?
Yes, actually, this is a very important point of how this tool can be used by non-Muslim minorities who live in Muslim contexts. I think and that's why we call Women Living Under Muslim Law not a Muslim organization, because we include women who are not also Muslim but live in a Muslim society. I think this kit can also be just as important for them to have an Islamic knowledge. It helps them in two ways. Yeah, one, to defend their rights because the law applies to minorities, like for instance in Iran, whether you are Christian or whatever, you still have to observe the hijab. So that's if they know the rules, it helps. The other thing is a lot of minorities in women cannot really raise their objection to some of the patriarchal practices, because as soon as they talk, they say, well, we cannot, as a minority, we cannot divide our community. So this kind of knowledge will provide for them opportunity to show that even in Islamic society, these are the rights, and then do similar things, create a similar kit for their own communities. And in that sense, it becomes a model for them to follow, and then to be able to raise these issues within the minority community, within the Muslim context. I think it's very important, and is a very useful example in that way.
Very good. And what about the question with respect to men's participation in this?
Well, at Women, we always had also male colleague involved, and in our workshop, the alliances with progressive male leaders has been very crucial for our success in the workshops we have had. So also, especially now, we work with a lot of young generation. The meetings includes both male and female, but also we have a specifically male group how they can help the women's rights group. So I think it's very important for them to also know all these young, like especially men from 14 to 25, they have sisters, wives, and all that, and they are interested to learn. It's unfortunate they had been excluded, so they see themselves in the opposite side. But at least in the last 6-7 years, they have been very much included in a lot of activities that Bloom and others, our sister organization, are doing. So I think it's a very important step to include men in the whole process.
Absolutely. Roya, did you want to add to that?
Sure. The one thing I want to add is picking up on what you said, Ambassador Vivier. Islam has been unfortunately used as a political tool. So to really use this in a very practical way, in addition to the knowledge and the resources that the toolkit provides from a epistemological perspective, you also need to teach the users the political dance that they have to do along with it, because it is simply that balance to be struck, when to be quiet, when to strike, when to ask a question, when to play dumb, and how to present it. Professor Hoodfer is smiling because we were practicing this when we were trying to work on the reform of the family law back in Afghanistan. And often, for me, it was never a statement. It was always a question, because I did not know anything. I was presenting everything as pretty much a question and seeking for their heavenly guidance to help me understand. And that opened the conversation. So that's also another aspect to be added.
Yes, and I think you and I and so many others are aware of circumstances where this issue has arisen. And often policymakers just say, well, this is how it is in that society, and women's rights really don't have a place. And I think what we're hearing loud and clear today is that women's rights in Islam are not inconsistent, and when it is used as a political tool in the way it has been, one needs to really address it in that context as well. Do we have any other questions, Ellie, before we close?
A couple quick ones. One here is asking, are there any themes or topics not covered in the toolkit or the short briefs that you mentioned, Aisha, that should be addressed in future iterations? And then a last one here. Is there anything giving you hope, especially on this dark anniversary, for the situation in Afghanistan that builds off this conversation?
Aisha?
Yes, there are some topics that we didn't cover in the toolkit, but some of them we started to cover in the briefs. And some of them have not been published yet, but we've been working on, like the hijab, we've been working on more specifically on domestic violence is another issue that we started working on. It's not published yet, but there's some other number of issues that we're working on. The custody issues, inheritance issues. These are land ownership issues. We're sort of working on those, but they're not yet published. In terms of hope, I think what is the most hope-inspiring thing that I see is the resilience and determination of Afghan women, and how they are committed to not give up, but to fight for their rights no matter what. I think that's really important and hopeful.
And that's a terrific word to end this discussion on. I think we all agree this discussion provides hope as well. And it is in that understanding that hopefully this tool will be used to be able to make progress in ways that are absolutely critical today. So great thanks to each of you, to Aisha, to Huma, to Palwasha, and to Roya. Your contributions have been invaluable. We want to make sure that everybody has access to this toolkit, and you can download it, the action guide, on the website, on the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security website, and we will provide updates on translations and on other additions to it. But please use it. That's why it was produced, to really make a difference on an absolutely critical issue, women's rights in Afghanistan and certainly beyond. So thank you to each of you, and thank you to our audience for your excellent questions and your participation. Goodbye.
Thank you.